Hey guys, tonight we journey into a world where sickness spread like gossip, doctors dressed like cursed birds, and your best shot at survival was carrying a dead toad in your armpit. Yes, it's time to talk about the Black Death, the ultimate party crasher of medieval Europe. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you enjoy mildly traumatizing history. Let me know in the comments what time it is, where you are, and whether your immune system is still intact. Now, dim the lights, maybe put on a scented sachet of lavender to keep the plague away, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Chapter 1. It begins with a rat, of course. It's the year 1347. Europe is doing just fine, thank you. There are cathedrals rising, bread being baked, peasants arguing over whether a duck is a witch, and not a clue in the world that things are about to go from bad to apocalyptic. You live in a bustling medieval town, let's say somewhere in France, though it hardly matters, because the plague is not picky. It's coming for everyone, rich, poor, devout, sinful, clean, dirty, you name it. You, however, are blissfully unaware. You wake up in a drafty wooden hut, shake out the fleas from your blanket, again, and start your day by not dying. Yet. Let's talk about what's happening elsewhere. Specifically, in the Crimean port city of Kaffa. Mongol armies are laying siege to the Genoese traders there, but this is no ordinary siege. The Mongols, running out of patience, and soldiers resort to horror. Soldiers are dying en masse, their bodies rotting fast, bursting with black boils and blood. So what do the Mongols do? They decide to launch the corpses over the city walls using catapults. Yes, that happened. It's the original biological warfare. The Genoese, understandably horrified by this medieval meat rain, flee on ships back to Italy. But here's the kicker, some of them are already infected. They bring with them not just spices and tales of siege, but the seeds of devastation. And those seeds, they have 6 legs and very bad intentions. Fleas. Specifically, fleas infected with Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible for what will soon be known as the Black Death. These fleas are the ultimate hitchhikers. They latch onto black rats, which are plentiful on ships, in granaries, and in every cozy corner of your soon-to-be-doomed village. And once those rats arrive, it begins. It starts slow. A merchant in Marseille feels under the weather. A baker's wife in Avignon has a strange swelling under her arm. A child in Paris develops a fever and can't keep food down. Nobody thinks much of it. People die all the time in medieval Europe. It's practically a hobby. But then, more people fall ill. And then more. And the symptoms are different. Victims develop painful swellings, called buboes, in the lymph nodes, armpits, neck, groin. These swellings turn black, rupture, and stink of rot. Patients vomit blood, develop fever, and become delirious. Some collapse and die within a day, others linger, suffering horribly. Soon, whole households are dead, streets are quiet, and the church bells toll more often than anyone likes. Your neighbor, Jacques, who once bragged about surviving the famine of 1315, is now lying in his bed, mumbling about angels and coughing up blood. The town priest is overwhelmed, administering last rites faster than he can remember names. You hear rumors that some people are dropping dead mid-sentence. Others are found days later, face down in their porridge, and no one knows what's causing it. The theories are creative. Some say it's the wrath of God, that humanity has become too sinful, too prideful, too indulgent in earthly pleasures like dancing and owning more than one chicken. Others blame the alignment of the planets. A few say it's bad air, miasma, they call it. The air itself, poisoned and foul, perhaps because of swamp fumes or corrupted winds. There are those who think Jews are poisoning the wells, which leads to horrific acts of violence and mass burnings, because fear turns very quickly into cruelty. Some believe it's witches, or maybe heretics. The truth? It's a microbe no one can see, carried by fleas that live on rats that sneak into homes like furry little death couriers. But that doesn't matter to you. What matters is that the town square, once filled with noisy vendors and bickering townsfolk, is now eerily quiet. The baker's stall is empty. The candlemaker hasn't opened his shop in a week. Even the tavern, which never closes, is locked shut. A dried bouquet of herbs nailed to the door. Your cousin says he heard about entire villages where no one is left, just dogs and goats roaming empty lanes, bodies in carts, silence where there should be songs. And he might not be exaggerating. In some places, up to 60% of the population died. Entire towns vanished. In England alone, the population fell from 6 million to about 3.5 million within a few short years. Florence lost over half its residents. In Avignon, they ran out of consecrated ground and had to dig massive plague pits where bodies were dumped by the hundreds. A famous chronicler in Sicily wrote, "Fathers abandoned children, wives their husbands, one brother another, for this illness seemed to strike through the breath and sight." A physician in Paris, known as Jean de Venette, described it this way: "The plague was so contagious that those who touched the clothes or sheets of the sick were immediately infected, and thus died, even the doctors who treated them." Another record, written by the Florentine chronicler Matteo Villani, reads, "Many lands and cities were made desolate. In many houses not a single person remained alive, and in the countryside entire villages were emptied of people, the fields left unplowed, the bread unbaked." From the diary of Agnolo di Tura, a shoemaker in Siena, "I buried 5 of my children with my own hands, and there are many who did likewise. Fathers abandoned children, wives their husbands. Death was everywhere. The mayor declares quarantine. No one in, no one out. But it's too late. The rats are already inside. Some people take to burning aromatic woods. Others douse themselves in vinegar or rosewater. A few wealthy households seal themselves inside, stacking bricks and praying the air won't seep in. One man walks through the town in a hair shirt, whipping himself and shouting Latin verses, convinced this will appease an angry God. People join him until there's a whole procession of bloodied backs and shouted prayers. But the plague doesn't care. You try to stay calm. You scrub your hands with lye. You hang bundles of garlic and lavender from your door. You even consider wearing a dead toad around your neck because your neighbor swears it's working. Your little sister starts coughing. 2 days later, she can't stand. Her skin is hot, her eyes wild. A black lump rises under her chin. You call the priest. He comes, says a few words, and tells you to pray. Then he leaves, fast. The next day, she's gone. There is no funeral, there is no time. You wrap her in cloth and place her gently in the cart that rolls by at dawn. The driver doesn't speak. He just nods. The cart is already full. You want to cry, but your eyes are dry. There is no room left for grief, only survival. That evening, as the sun sets blood red over a town that smells like smoke and despair, you hear someone else is coming. Not a priest, not a merchant, a doctor. People whisper about him. He wears a black robe, carries a stick, wears a mask with a beak. A birdman. They say he survived the plague in Florence, or maybe it was Venice, or maybe he just says that to get paid. Either way, he's here, and everyone is already dying. Chapter 2. The Birdman Cometh. You've seen death, but now you see something even stranger, someone claiming they can stop it. While the iconic beaked costume would only appear centuries later, the fear it embodied began here. The image we now associate with plague doctors, black robes, leather gloves, and a bird-like mask, was popularized in the 17th century, but the role it symbolized took shape much earlier. He's wearing black from head to toe, thick leather gloves, a wide-brimmed hat, and most disturbing of all, a mask shaped like a long-beaked bird. You blink. He does not. He can't. The eyes of the mask are glass, foggy and unmoving. His whole body looks like a walking funeral. This is your plague doctor. He doesn't speak, not yet. Instead, he surveys the scene, cane tapping the cobblestones as he walks. He doesn't touch anyone directly. The stick does that for him, lifting bed linens, pointing at buboes, occasionally nudging a corpse to see if it twitches. A real professional. But who is he? Where did he train? That's the fun part. He didn't. Most plague doctors weren't physicians in the modern sense. They weren't trained in anatomy or epidemiology. Some had read a few medical texts. Others were just people who hadn't died yet and needed work. Being immune to the plague wasn't a job requirement. Being available was. In fact, some towns just hired whoever would take the job. The position was dangerous, poorly understood, and often fatal. But in desperate times, you don't ask for diplomas. You ask for someone who's willing to stand next to a dying man without crying. The costume? That came later, more 17th century than 14th, but it stuck in the cultural imagination. Still, the logic behind it was surprisingly sound. Sort of. The beaked mask was designed to protect the wearer from miasma, bad air, thought to carry disease. Inside the beak were strong-smelling herbs, lavender, mint, cloves, camphor, things that stung the nose and soothed the soul. The belief was simple. If you couldn't smell the bad air, it couldn't hurt you. Period medical treatises suggested all sorts of aromatic countermeasures. A 14th century recommendation: take equal parts of wormwood, marjoram, sage, and mint, and place them in a linen sachet. Breathe through it in times of pestilence. Your plague doctor? He's got about 6 of these stuffed in his beak. The long robe, it's coated in wax or oil. Supposedly, it repels disease. Realistically, it just makes him sweat like a boiled turnip. But again, it's about separation. Anything to put a layer between him and death. And the stick? That's not just for poking patients. It's also for self-defense. Sometimes families, mad with grief, don't want to hear what the doctor has to say. Sometimes they want someone to blame. He steps into your home. He sees your father. Buboes under his arms. Fever, black spots, rasping breath. The doctor nods. He writes something down in a little book. You never see what. He offers no medicine. Maybe a tincture of wine and herbs, maybe a poultice made of onions and goose fat. None of it works. He knows that. You know that. But still, something must be done. Because the worst part isn't the pain, it's doing nothing. In some towns, plague doctors kept records, rudimentary death registries. A few survive today, from Milan, 1374. 7 died in this house, 5 in the next. The man who lived alone near the well died after 3 days. In Rouen, a record reads, "Here lived a shoemaker. Wife, 3 children, all perished." The doctor passed this house and marked it with a cross. And here he is, standing in your doorway. A crowd gathers outside. They peer at him from behind shutters. Children watch in awe. The priest refuses to come anymore. But the doctor, they say he walks through 10 houses a day and still breathes. Whispers follow him. Some say he's a necromancer. Others say he drinks the blood of the dead to gain immunity. One rumor says he's already died, and this is his ghost finishing its rounds. He doesn't correct them. Why would he? You ask him, "Will my mother survive?" He does not answer. He leaves a packet of herbs, a prayer scribbled in Latin, and a warning: burn the linens, bury the body deep. Then he's gone. That's medicine in the 14th century. A famous physician, Guy de Chauliac, wrote during the plague, "The swellings appeared in the groin or under the armpits, and death occurred within 3 days. Physicians and attendants were scarce, and many fled. I remained and treated the sick." Guy himself caught the plague. Somehow he survived, but most did not. Yet the role of the plague doctor was more than medical. It was psychological. He was a symbol of resistance, of false hope, of desperation made visible. In towns where the panic was most intense, the doctor became an object of obsession. Children would imitate him, fashioning masks from scraps and paper. Adults made icons out of beaked silhouettes. In some accounts, entire households begged plague doctors not to leave, seeing them as the only line between them and death. A fragment from a letter written in Venice in 1349 reads, "The doctor came today. My wife kissed the hem of his robe and offered him a pouch of coins. He refused. He would not speak, only pointed to the child and shook his head." Another account, written by a woman in Lubeck, reads, "We are told to light fires and keep our windows closed. The doctor left a bundle of dried orange peel and said we must burn it if the smell of rot grows too strong. I cannot tell what day it is. I no longer feel the cold." The advice given by plague doctors was often inconsistent and at times wildly imaginative. Avoid sleeping during the day. Your humors may be stirred. Eat no fruit. Drink wine with crushed emerald if you can afford it. Place a ruby on your tongue before entering a sick room. Fumigate your home with sulfur, thyme, or, failing that, pig hair. One manuscript advised, "To avoid infection, do not share jokes or stories. Laughter opens the mouth too wide." As odd as this sounds, it wasn't pure quackery. There was method in the madness. Anything that created space, distance, cleanliness, or at least the illusion of it, helped. Perhaps not in killing bacteria, but in managing fear. The longer the plague raged, the more the doctor became part of the landscape. But over time, he began to rot too, not in flesh, but in reputation. Some accused plague doctors of hastening death. If a doctor marked your door, it was over. Their visits became curses. There are town records from Bavaria in 1350 that show plague doctors being banned from certain districts, not because they weren't needed, but because residents feared them more than the plague. A priest in Ghent wrote, "A woman spat upon the mask of the doctor, calling him death in feathers. The crowd laughed. That night, her house was silent." Even in this bleakness, some doctors tried. One anonymous record reads, "I cut the bubo open and drained it with a goose quill. The child lived 3 more days. I consider this a success." Another wrote, bitterly, "I have seen the eyes of 300 mothers. They all ask the same thing. I do not have an answer. Only this robe, this mask, this stick." The doctors did what they could. Some survived, many didn't. But they walked into the thick of death when others ran, and that meant something. So the next time you see a photo of that iconic beaked mask, remember, it wasn't just creepy. It was hope, stitched in leather and soaked in sweat. And the plague doctor? He didn't save everyone, but he showed up anyway. And sometimes that was the only medicine people had. Chapter 3. treatments that will kill you faster. So, let's say you're not dead yet. Congratulations. You're in the lucky or unlucky minority who can still stagger, cough, and cry out for help. Naturally, you do what any rational person in the 14th century would do: call the doctor, pray to the saints, and prepare to be cured with vinegar, leeches, and possibly fire. Let's talk about treatments. You've got options. They're all terrible. The most common first step? Bloodletting. This is where someone, either a physician, barber, or your cousin with a pointy knife, makes a cut, drains your blood into a bowl, and watches you go pale with hope. The logic is simple. Too much blood causes illness. Reduce the blood, reduce the problem. Here's the catch. The bubonic plague isn't caused by excessive fluids. It's caused by bacteria in your lymphatic system. But hey, who's counting? Bloodletting tools varied from elegant lancets to rusty razors. One 14th century French guide instructed, bleed from the right arm on Mondays and Thursdays, from the left on Wednesdays. On Fridays, avoid all bleeding, or the soul may flee. If you survived the bloodletting, the next option was lancing the buboes. This meant cutting open the painful, pus-filled swellings under your arms or in your groin. The belief was that releasing the poison would help. In practice, it often just introduced more bacteria into an already infected wound. Accounts from the time describe this in vivid detail. A Flemish doctor wrote, "I lanced a swelling the size of a child's fist. The fluid was dark and foul, and the man died before the candle burned down." In some places, the lancing was done with hot irons, under the belief that cauterizing the wound could burn out the sickness. Nothing like medieval healthcare to combine surgery and blacksmithing. But let's say you wanted something gentler. Less fire, more herbs. Enter the world of plague poultices and potions. Your apothecary, or more likely, your neighbor who once treated a goat rash, might brew a decoction of crushed onions, garlic, vinegar, and rosewater. This would be rubbed on the chest, tied in a cloth, and left overnight. Another popular recipe: boil crushed emeralds in wine. Drink once every 4 hours until symptoms worsen or you run out of gemstones. Wealthy households might try saffron, thought to purify the blood. Poorer homes may do with mustard plasters, pigeon guts, or chewed parsley. One manuscript recommends applying the shaved belly of a live plucked chicken to the buboes. Each day, a new chicken. If the bird died quickly, it meant the disease had been drawn out. If it lived, well, it needed more time. A chronicler in Nuremberg wrote, "The apothecary mixed wine, powdered pearls, and a sliver of mummy flesh. The widow drank and declared herself better. She died that evening." Yes, you read that right. Mumia, powdered mummy, was a luxury cure imported from Egypt. Nothing says hope like ingesting 1,000-year-old remains. Still not working? Time to escalate. Smoke. Lots of it. Some doctors believed that plague couldn't survive heat or strong smells, so they prescribed the burning of sulfur, rosemary, juniper, or pitch inside sealed rooms. Patients were told to sit, wrapped in damp cloth, while the chamber filled with choking fumes. You coughed, you cried, you hallucinated, you still died, but not always. Occasionally, someone got better, and that's the real tragedy. Just enough people recovered to give hope, to justify trying again. Let's look at a few more real examples from medieval medical texts. A 14th century treatise from Montpellier advised that patients should avoid sleep, onions, baths, and sexual intercourse. Baths, because opening the pores might let the plague in. Onions, because they were of moist, humoral nature, which was bad news if your black bile was already acting up. One text from Bologna suggested placing crushed emeralds on the temples and lying in bed while holding a warm puppy, preferably one without fleas. Another scholar insisted the plague would flee from the presence of music and pleasant conversation, resulting in bizarre reports of noble families hosting lute concerts in sealed ballrooms filled with incense while servants died just outside the door. Another cure that was bizarrely popular: urine therapy. Patients were advised to drink their own urine thrice daily, sometimes mixed with ash or powdered rose petals. A merchant in Cologne claimed it saved his wife. Records suggest she survived, though it's unclear if it was because of the urine or in spite of it. In the Middle East, where plague hit later, physicians like Ibn al-Khatib documented observations with surprising accuracy. He noted, contagion is transmitted by garments, vessels, and earrings. While Europe clung to miasma, Arabic medical scholars were inching closer to the concept of infection. But treatment also came from more superstitious corners. Many believed amulets and charms could protect the wearer. A popular one in rural France read, "Abracadabra," in an inverted triangle, meant to trap the illness as it descended through the letters. Others relied on the dried hearts of wolves, crosses of lead, or toads sewn into pouches. In Italy, the so-called Four Thieves vinegar became famous, a mix of vinegar, rosemary, sage, lavender, wormwood, and garlic, supposedly used by a group of robbers who stole from plague victims without falling ill. They were eventually caught and hanged, but their recipe lived on, and versions of it are still sold today. In Avignon, one physician prescribed cutting a pigeon open and pressing its raw, bleeding breast against a patient's plague boil. When the pigeon inevitably died, a new one was applied. A noblewoman once demanded 17 pigeons in a day. It's not known whether she survived, but the pigeons definitely didn't. Let's not forget what it felt like. Imagine you're lying on a straw mattress soaked with sweat. You can't breathe through your nose. Your joints ache so fiercely you can't turn your head. A boil the size of an orange pulses under your arm. It smells like rotting meat. Your family won't enter the room anymore. They push bread through a curtain and whisper prayers. Outside, the street is quiet, except when the cart rolls by. "Bring out your dead," someone shouts. Your neighbor's house was sealed yesterday. The red X on the door glistens with fresh paint. You remember laughing with them over burned pottage just last week. You hope someone remembers your name. But it wasn't just physical pain. There was the fear, the unbearable, sleepless fear. One wrong breath, one stray cough, one fleck of spit, and your whole house could be doomed. A man in Norwich recorded in his journal, "I have burned all our linen. I have salted the doors. My wife does not speak aloud. My children wear no shoes. We do not open the shutters." A woman in Siena wrote in a letter, "The baby does not cry. He only watches me. I think he knows." And still, amid all of this, people kept living. Somehow. Some doctors tried to adapt. In Milan, families with suspected plague were sealed in their homes, with food passed through hatches. In Dubrovnik, quarantine islands were established to isolate travelers. A few doctors began noting patterns, that caregivers fell ill, that corpses still spread infection, that isolation helped. They didn't know about bacteria, but they knew something invisible was hunting them, and that knowledge changed how they moved, breathed, and lived. So, yes, the treatments were absurd, desperate, horrifying, but at their core, they were also deeply human. They were acts of belief, of resistance, of trying. Because when death is everywhere, even a bundle of herbs in a beak, or a bleeding pigeon, or a pearl in wine can feel like hope. And sometimes, just sometimes, hope is all you have. So, next time you complain about cough syrup, remember, you could be in a sealed room, under a cloud of sulfur smoke, clutching a toad pouch and sipping ruby ash, and calling that a cure. Chapter 4. Mass panic is the only constant. So far, the Black Death has shattered bodies and broken medicine, but now we reach something even harder to contain: people. Because no matter how deadly the plague becomes, the real catastrophe begins when everyone realizes they might be next. Mass panic wasn't just an unfortunate side effect. It was a defining feature of the pandemic. Entire towns transformed overnight. The butcher stopped butchering. The priest stopped preaching. The baker's oven went cold. Markets turned into ghost squares, and even the rats seemed to vanish. And in their place, fear, rumor, blame. Let's start with the streets. At the peak of the plague, many towns simply emptied. Those who could flee to the countryside did so, abandoning homes, jobs, and neighbors. The logic was simple. Plague is in the air, so get away from the breath of others. But what happened when entire cities tried to run? Chaos. Roads filled with carts. Farmhouses swelled with unwelcome guests. Some villages posted guards to block outsiders. In Florence, refugees from the city were beaten at the gates of surrounding towns. A merchant's journal from 1348 notes: "We reached the edge of Siena and were denied entry. A boy threw stones. My mother wept and said she'd rather face the pestilence than the hearts of strangers." For those who stayed behind, reality unraveled. Daily life collapsed. Wells ran dry because no one would carry water. Firewood vanished. Graves went undug. In London, corpses piled up in the streets for lack of diggers. In Paris, carts of the dead were pushed by children. In Avignon, Pope Clement VI consecrated the entire Rhone River as holy ground because there was no more space to bury the bodies. In some places, carts weren't even needed. The dead were pushed into cellars, thrown in abandoned wells, or simply left where they fell. One anonymous monk in England wrote, "There is no music, no weddings, no church bells except to mark another death. We eat only what we can steal, and each morning we count the living." Fear turned into superstition. People began blaming the stars. A 1345 planetary conjunction, Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars, was believed to have poisoned the air. Medical astrologers advised hiding indoors on the days when Mars shone red. Others blamed corrupted air, leading to mass burnings of incense and herbs. Wealthy households hung sponges soaked in vinegar from their ceilings. Entire neighborhoods reeked of ash, garlic, and panic. Then came the darker blame. Scapegoats, Jews, foreigners, lepers, and beggars were all accused of spreading the plague. Some said Jews had poisoned the wells, an accusation that led to horrifying pogroms across Europe. In Strasbourg, 1349, over 2,000 Jews were burned alive in the town square. In Mainz, Cologne, and Basel, entire Jewish communities were wiped out, not by disease, but by mobs. A rabbi in Spain wrote, "We are dying in the streets, and yet they say we caused it. Our women are whipped, our children stoned. May heaven forgive this madness." Others turned to religion, but not all prayers brought peace. Groups of flagellants, men who whipped themselves bloody, began marching through Europe. They sang dirges, beat their backs, and claimed they could cleanse the sins that brought the plague. In some towns they were greeted as heroes. In others they became their own form of terror. They beat suspected sinners, burned books, demanded obedience. Eventually, the Pope condemned them. But by then, they had become a movement. The line between holy fervor and mass hysteria had vanished. People did strange things. In Venice, one noble family bricked themselves inside their home with 2 months' food and a cat. When the food ran out, no one opened the door. In Germany, a man was arrested for dancing through plague districts, singing that death was a lie. He was beaten by a crowd, then buried in a shallow grave. Days later, someone claimed to see him walking again. Mass hysteria or hallucination, we'll never know. In England, some believed wearing red and eating only radishes would ward off death. In Prague, people stayed awake all night to avoid dreaming the sickness in. In one Dutch village, the mayor issued an ordinance that all town conversations must be cheerful. Anyone caught talking about death was fined 2 chickens, and still the plague rolled on. Doctors abandoned their patients. Priests died administering last rites. Entire families vanished from the census, replaced with nothing but a line scratched through a name. Letters from the time are haunted with brevity. Mother gone, brother fevered, staying in cellar, send candles. The streets are empty now, even the dogs do not bark. In the wake of death, society reshaped itself. Survivors inherited property overnight. Labor shortages gave peasants unprecedented bargaining power. A servant who had scrubbed floors for pennies was suddenly being begged to manage farms. Guilds collapsed. New ones formed. Laws were rewritten. Wages rose. Fear remained. But even in panic, people still reached for normalcy. Some held weddings in cemeteries, believing death could not find them among the already buried. Others painted charms on their doorways. Some hosted masked feasts in the belief that anonymity might fool the plague. A woman in Florence wrote, "I married today. We danced on a blanket over fresh graves. The music made my sister weep. And the psychological toll, devastating." People lost not just family, but their sense of time, order, and identity. Some chroniclers noted that survivors forgot how to write or read, having spent so long locked in silence or grief. Children were orphaned en masse. In some places, packs of feral toddlers wandered town ruins, cared for by elderly widows or priests who'd lost everyone else. A priest in Bruges recorded, "I buried 5 infants today, none baptized, their names unknown, their mothers also gone." A man in Krakow scrawled on a chapel wall, "If God will not save us, then let the crows take us." Songs changed. Language changed. Art grew darker, sharper. Skeletons appeared in frescoes. Graveyards crept into architecture, and everywhere, eyes, wide, horrified eyes. Statues of saints stopped smiling. Even survivors weren't really safe. People who lived through the plague were often suspected of witchcraft or heresy. In some towns, entire survivor families were driven out by mobs. "They are different now," one mayor wrote. "They did not weep for the lost." The economy twisted itself into knots. Prices soared and crashed at random. In one town, a chicken cost more than a horse. In another, gold was worthless. There was simply no one left to trade with. In England, the Statute of Laborers was passed in 1351 to prevent peasants from demanding higher wages. It failed. Laborers had leverage now. They began negotiating, leaving, demanding better treatment. This shift, tiny, almost imperceptible, would eventually tip the scales of feudalism. Not because anyone planned it, but because too many landlords died and too many peasants lived. Culture warped. Theater troupes started performing morality plays with sudden death scenes and characters named things like pestilence and despair. Poets wrote of empty cities and dancing skeletons. Musicians composed dirges that became wedding songs. In one town in Germany, a choir sang Mass alone to an empty cathedral for weeks. The survivors didn't just continue life, they rebuilt it, nervously, awkwardly, like children with burned fingers learning to draw again. And still, the plague wasn't finished. It came back again and again. Every few years, a new flare-up. Smaller, but still terrifying. By the early 1400s, children were growing up with plague drills. In some cities, every child over 6 knew how to hang vinegar cloths and burn rosemary without being told. The trauma embedded itself. A woman in Naples was quoted saying, "I never let my son sleep without shoes. If we run, we must be ready." A baker in Ghent slept in his oven. "It is the cleanest place," he explained. Some families buried their wealth in graveyards, believing the dead would guard it. Others paid masons to seal their homes in stone, leaving only a hatch for food. A few of those homes were never reopened. So yes, the mass panic was a monster of its own, but like all monsters, it left survivors, scarred, different, but still breathing. And when the smoke cleared and the doors unbricked and the children stepped out into streets with no echoes, what was left was something utterly new. Not stronger, not wiser, but aware. The plague taught Europe one unforgettable lesson, that life is short, cruel, and deeply random. But also that humans keep going, even when the world ends. And that may be the most terrifying and beautiful panic response of all. Chapter 5. Health insurance equals a sack of onions and prayer. So you've survived, for now. Maybe you ran, maybe you hid, maybe you passed every test the Black Death threw at you and came out the other side breathless, bloodied, but standing. What now? You're not just alive, you're responsible. For the sick, for the bodies, for putting one foot in front of the other and pretending there's still a world worth returning to. But before you do that, you have a problem. You're broke. The doctor is dead, the priest is sick, the apothecary fled, and the healer who once charged in silver now takes whatever you have: eggs, fabric, promises, or prayers. Welcome to medieval health care. Let's talk insurance. There isn't any. There are no hospitals as we understand them. No subsidies, no emergency funding, no governmental relief. If you want help, you pay for it, or you trade. What did you pay with? Chickens, ale, a daughter's dowry, a sack of flour, your next harvest. If you're poor, it's whatever you could carry while vomiting. And even then, there were no guarantees. A French town record from 1349 reads, "The doctor said he would not enter the house unless we gave him 6 onions. We had only 3. He blessed us from the window." In London, some plague doctors charged per deathbed visit. If the patient lived, a bonus. If they died, full price, no refunds. Morbidly efficient. So, what did people do? They improvised. Neighborhoods formed mutual aid groups. If someone died, others would carry the body. If someone was sick, neighbors might cook food and pass it through a shutter. But not out of generosity, out of necessity. Because if your neighbors didn't help, you were already dead. Some guilds collected small dues to support members during illness. In rare cases, this included funding for candles, a coffin, or a basic burial. In Florence, a textile guild issued tokens that could be exchanged for bread and herbs during plague surges, but the supply chain collapsed by week 2. Priests were supposed to help. Many didn't. Some were brave. They visited homes, prayed with the dying, buried the dead. Others disappeared overnight. In some towns, surviving clergy demanded payment before administering last rites: a sack of grain, a goat, a fine cloak. One letter from Avignon tells of a widow who gave her family's last saltfish to a friar for the privilege of hearing her husband's name spoken in Mass. She starved, but her husband presumably got his seat in heaven. Charity became transactional. Even monasteries, usually generous, began guarding their stocks. Bread was passed through gates with tongs. Coins were left in vinegar bowls. Some abbots required letters of recommendation before offering shelter. One nun in Bruges recorded, "We turned away a child and his mother. The sisters wept, but we had no more room." Hospitals, where they existed, were mostly places to die in peace. Many were converted leper houses or almshouses run by religious orders. Few had doctors. Most had prayer books and clean straw. And what about the doctors who did stay? They were rare, pricier than ever. Some charged 10 times their usual rate. Others worked for food and shelter. But by now, no one trusted doctors. If your family survived after a doctor's visit, he was a saint. If they died, he was a murderer. One man in Pisa beat a plague doctor to death with his own cane. The court record reads simply, "His wife had died that morning." He said the doctor brought death, not cure. So, how did people prepare for illness? They didn't, not really. Some made charms. Others paid astrologers. A few buried coins in the hearth as an offering to death itself. A baker in Vienna slept with a lamb under his bed and 4 cloves of garlic between his toes. He survived. A fisherman in Marseille locked himself in a wine cellar with a jar of honey and a painting of Saint Sebastian. He also survived. None of this makes sense. But then again, what part of the plague ever did? Eventually, a new economy emerged. Death begat demand. Survivors had leverage. Healers began charging preemptively before symptoms appeared. In one town, a woman sold a plague-proof recipe for 5 silver coins. It was wine, rosemary, and crushed chalk. She made a fortune. Later, she got the plague. Some gravediggers charged by the limb. One inn in Flanders offered clean beds, hot ale, and plague-free sleep. The sign didn't age well. Even the idea of medical debt was different. There was no paperwork, just memory. Agreements spoken over firelight. Promises whispered to a sickbed. And if the debtor died, that promise sometimes fell to the survivors. One daughter in Lübeck was taken into domestic servitude for 3 years because her father had died, owing a town healer 3 goats and a winter cloak. In Florence, entire family estates were seized to cover unpaid burial fees. Meanwhile, opportunists flourished. Not just fake doctors, but sellers of relics, talismans, miracle herbs. A man in Toulouse claimed, whether sincerely or as a marketing stunt, that his jar of blood of Saint Apollonia could cure the plague. It turned out to be red wine, clove, and snake bile. He sold out anyway. According to local legend, a child in Milan survived after sleeping with a consecrated sausage under his pillow. People lined up to touch it like a holy relic. The sausage was eventually stolen. As for what happened next, your guess is as good as any medieval chronicler's. For the poor, suffering became generational. Children orphaned by the plague were often forced into work or worse. If a parent died owing money for treatment, the child might be auctioned off as labor. A legal contract in Poitiers from 1350 shows a 6-year-old indentured to a winemaker in exchange for her late mother's herbal debts. This cycle fed a grim economy of grief. Clothiers made fortunes sewing shrouds. Blacksmiths minted hundreds of new coffin nails. Artists painted memento mori for wealthy patrons who wanted to be remembered, but only if the artist survived long enough to finish the work. Even healing became bureaucratic. By the later waves of plague, some cities attempted rudimentary licensing. Venice issued badges for verified plague caretakers. Others carried letters of exemption, but these protections meant nothing in the eyes of a grieving crowd. A physician in Avignon was beaten unconscious because someone accused him of bringing plague into the quarter. His badge was torn off and nailed to a church door. The caption written beneath, "This man brings worms." And if you couldn't afford a healer, you prayed, you begged, you tried anything. An herbalist in Ghent gave out free poultices to the poor, asking only that they say her name aloud if they recovered. "Remembering is payment enough," she said. One village elder near Marseille reportedly healed the sick with prayers, honey compresses, and songs in the Occitan dialect. He asked for nothing in return. He died during the third wave, buried in a mass grave under a tablet that simply read, "Sang." Then there were those who helped in silence. Mothers who held children while knowing what the fever meant. Neighbors who buried neighbors. Lovers who touched plague-blackened skin with bare hands because the alternative, watching someone die alone, was worse. There's no invoice for that. No ledger for bravery performed without witness. But in the wreckage of the plague, that kind of care, quiet, unpaid, unpaidable, became the only form of healing that truly mattered. So yes, your health insurance was a sack of onions and a prayer. But it was also a loaf passed through a shutter, a voice on the other side of the door, a hand reaching for yours when you were too sick to speak. And in the end, that may have been enough. Because even when the coin was gone, the doctors fled, and the prayers dried up. People still tried. And that, in the end, was the only real policy in plague-era healthcare. Survive first. Pay later. Hope always. Chapter 6. The New World. The Plague Built. The plague didn't just leave behind graves, it left behind questions. Who are we now? What kind of world is this? And what do you do with a society where half the people are gone, but the debts, the fears, and the fields remain? For the survivors, there was no back to normal. There was only forward through ash and silence. The landscape changed first. Fields lay fallow. Orchards overgrew. Entire villages disappeared from the maps. The roads to them crumbled. Their names became ghost syllables passed between travelers. Some towns were reclaimed by wilderness. Wild dogs howled in empty churches. Ivy crept over stone walls. Owls nested in bell towers. In England alone, over 1,300 villages were abandoned, their land taken over by weeds, weather, and memory. A notary in Provence wrote, "We passed a place where homes had once stood. The only sound was wind through chimney stones." And with the people gone, nature crept back in, boars rooting in vegetable patches, wolves walking city streets, vines curling around the altars where prayers once echoed. The economy broke, then rebooted. With so many dead, labor became precious. Serfs who once had no say were now courted by desperate lords. Entire estates offered wages, land, even clothing to anyone who would work. This terrified the elites. New laws tried to lock wages, to freeze mobility, to chain the living to the expectations of the dead. It didn't work. The living had seen too much to accept silence. The roots of revolution were planted in plague-soaked soil. The peasant uprisings that would shake Europe in the following centuries had their seeds here, in the bargaining power of the plowman who'd seen his master die and realized he didn't need permission to survive. Culture transformed. Gone were the saints with perfect faces. Now came the danse macabre, skeletons holding hands with nobles and peasants alike, dancing in eternal equality. Writers turned grim. Art turned grotesque. Death was no longer a whisper in the background, it was the main character. In literature, even love was haunted. Ballads spoke of lords who wed plague ghosts, of maidens who fell in love with men who decayed before sunrise. The idea of memento mori, remember death, became more than philosophy, it was fashion. Skeleton rings, hourglass brooches, coffin-shaped lockets with locks of hair from the perished. Tapestries now showed not only kings and saints, but skulls and crowns. Books of hours included death scenes. Marginalia in surviving manuscripts often included doodles of plague carts and grim reapers, proof that even monks coped with gallows humor. Medicine struggled to catch up. The old theories had failed. Miasma, humors, astrological charts. They couldn't explain why one child died and the next lived. Slowly, the seeds of observation were planted. Quarantine became official policy in port cities. Doctors began tracking patterns. In Italy, the first lazarettos, isolation hospitals, were built. Ships were held offshore. Houses were sealed with guard watches. People still died, but some survived. In universities, new questions were asked. Anatomy texts began to be copied with greater interest. Arabic medical writings, once dismissed, gained new followers. The process was uneven, painful, and often dismissed by conservative scholars. But it had begun. The slow crawl toward the scientific method was sparked by desperation. Religion fractured. Faith didn't disappear, but certainty did. Why did the priest die and the gambler live? Why did a child with rosaries on her chest rot beside a man who never prayed? The church tried to explain. Some priests said it was a test. Others said it was punishment. But the people had seen too much. Heard too many prayers go unanswered. They still believed, but not always in the same way. Heresy crept in. So did quiet rebellion. The seeds of reformation were sprinkled by plague. In some regions, fringe movements took hold. Flagellant cults, mystical sects, prophetic breakaways. Some claimed they'd spoken with the dead. Others claimed they'd been spared because of divine purity or cosmic randomness. Pilgrimages surged. So did offerings to local saints. Relic economies boomed, but under all of it was a current of unease. What happens when divine justice starts to feel arbitrary? Daily life resumed, sort of. People married, had children, planted fields. But they did so differently. More people wrote wills. More women learned trades. More children learned to read, because their parents had died, and books were all that was left. The world had been remade, unevenly, imperfectly, but undeniably. In some places, laws changed to allow widows to inherit land. In others, daughters took over family businesses. Gender roles bent under the weight of survival. Superstition and pragmatism sat side by side. A mother might hang garlic in the window while teaching her son to boil water for poultices. A father might pray while also sharpening tools and storing grain. Caution became a virtue. So did memory. Education took on new urgency. Before the plague, formal education had been reserved mostly for the clergy, nobility, or wealthy merchant sons. But in the wake of the devastation, learning became a survival skill, a means of securing work, of interpreting contracts, of keeping records when all the scribes were gone. Women began to read more. Girls inherited family shops and had to learn arithmetic, trade dialects, and letter writing. Schools, once half empty and exclusive, found themselves with new faces, new voices, some orphaned, some ambitious, all aware that ignorance had not saved their parents. In places like Italy and the Low Countries, grammar schools doubled in number. The printing press was still a century away, but the hunger for literacy was already rumbling. And when books were copied, they began to change. Margins that once hosted pious notes now included observations about boils, symptoms, herbs, even death jokes. The line between scholarship and survival blurred beautifully. Community rewove itself, awkwardly, tenderly, differently. The plague had torn networks apart. Families had vanished. Guilds had crumbled. Whole neighborhoods were reduced to 3 old men and a goat. But slowly, new bonds formed. A shoemaker might partner with a carpenter to run a bakery, not because they were bakers, but because the baker had died, and the village still needed bread. People married across class lines. Feudal loyalties were renegotiated. In some places, town councils were populated by survivors who, weeks earlier, wouldn't have been allowed to sweep the church steps. Everyone had lost something. That became a shared language. A boy from Rouen wrote years later, "My mother taught me to boil wine and hold my breath. My uncle taught me to count sheep and stitch linen. The village taught me how not to cry when you see a red cross on a door." Memorials took strange shapes. Some were massive: stone chapels, plague crosses, murals with grim angels watching over fields of skulls. Others were quiet: a ring etched with initials, a garden planted on the site of a burned cottage, a cloth doll left in a window, dressed in the clothes of someone who didn't return. The grief didn't vanish. It just changed form. One chronicler in Nuremberg said, "We do not speak their names at meals, but we leave a seat for them in silence." And history noticed. The Black Death became more than tragedy. It became a hinge, a pressure point that turned feudalism into something else. That cracked the armor of blind tradition. That taught Europe to look inward and outward. Trade resumed. So did exploration. People wanted answers. If the East had brought plague, perhaps it also held cures. If isolation bred rot, maybe travel could breed wisdom. Maps were redrawn. Borders shifted. Curiosity, once considered dangerous, became a tool. Slowly, then fervently. Without the plague, we might still believe that illness was a wind, or a sin, or a star's bad mood. With it, we learned to ask, and ask again. So the next time you step into a clinic, pick up a book, or light a candle for someone gone, remember that long ago, a world ended. But not everyone stayed dead. Some stood, walked, remembered, rebuilt. That's why you're here. That's why we still write. Because after plague, we tell the story, and that keeps us alive. Chapter 7. The Things They Left Behind. But even now their traces remain. Not the ones in museums, but the ones stitched into daily life. A patched sock, a phrase your grandmother muttered without knowing why. Objects that outlived the people who held them. Traces of the quiet, daily courage that never made it into epic poems. A child's spoon, a prayer scrawled on parchment, a necklace made of rosemary stems, a mask that smells faintly of vinegar, a stained apron stiff with soot and effort. These are the things they left behind, not because they wanted to be remembered, but because they had no time to clean up. You can still find them in museums and tombs, in the gaps between cathedral floor tiles. A comb carved by hand. A note, "Wait for me near the well." A shoe too small for an adult, too practical for a doll. They didn't know they were making history. They were just trying to make it to next week. These aren't grand monuments. They are the scraps of survival. The plague didn't just test medicine, it tested memory. And memory, like plague, spreads, but it also fades. So, these items, they anchor us, remind us. Someone was here, they lived, they stitched this cloth, they sharpened this blade, they buried their father with this bell. But memory has layers. It's in the dirt beneath your feet, in the way streets bend around old cemeteries, in the cornerstones of rebuilt homes, carved hastily with initials you can barely read. Archaeologists have found charms tucked under floorboards, teeth, dried herbs, shards of pottery arranged like stars. None of them officially healing, but all of them clearly meant to keep something away. One excavation in the Netherlands uncovered a leather pouch containing a dried flower, a coin, and a small lump of what may have been hair, interpreted by some archaeologists as a kind of child's fear kit. It's said that in Venice, a market square now sits atop a former plague pit. Tourists pass by, licking gelato, unaware they may be walking where mourners once dropped bodies and whispered hurried farewells. The objects are mundane, which is what makes them profound. A cracked bowl mended with string, a tin whistle with bite marks, a recipe for broth written phonetically. These aren't relics of saints or kings. They are proof of a stubborn will to live. They remind us that dignity isn't found in marble statues but in patched socks, that love is sometimes a chipped cup wrapped in linen and left by a sickbed. Not all remnants were physical. Some were habits, traditions, phrases passed down with no known origin. Don't whistle indoors. Leave shoes by the door. Say the name of the dead when the wind shifts. These customs outlived their reasons, but they did their job. They carried memory forward. Even language shifted. The word goodbye took deeper root. The idea of keeping watch at night became more than spiritual. It was survival. Families carried their dead with them, sometimes literally, sometimes in name. A son might be named after an uncle lost to the plague. A lullaby might begin with a verse once sung to the dying. A baker might hang a sign in the shape of a loaf, mimicking the one his grandmother used when food was rationed. These tiny gestures say, "We were there. We lived through that. We made it out." And what about the places never touched? Yes, some villages survived unscathed. Some were spared by geography, luck, or quarantine that held. And in those places what they left behind was absence. No plague pits, no shrines, no charms buried under hearthstones. And yet, even there, the silence is a kind of artifact. Because while they didn't bury hundreds, they still heard the bells. They still feared the wind. They still waited. Survival does not erase the presence of death. It only changes how it's acknowledged. In every museum drawer and church archive, these things hum quietly. They say, "We mattered." Not just the nobles, not just the doctors, but the washerwomen, the street vendors, the scared boys who learned to plant turnips too early and built new rituals out of nervous hands. Some museums display beak masks behind glass, but rarely do they show the vinegar-soaked straw. They show plague coins, but not the fingers that rubbed them smooth before buying herbs that didn't work. They show tombs, but not the quilts made of cut-up garments when cloth ran short and every stitch was a decision between function and mourning. But maybe that's okay, because the truest monuments to plague survival aren't in stone, they're in us. In the rituals we forgot had meaning, in the aversions we never questioned, in the deep breath before entering a crowded room. We are walking reliquaries of everything they endured. And though we may never see the names on their bowls, or know who last touched the charm under the floorboard, we carry them. In fear, in stubbornness, in kindness passed forward, they are the things they left behind. And we are still finding them. Every disaster has debris. Every plague leaves artifacts. Not just bones and ledgers, but whispers. Objects that outlived the people who held them. Traces of the quiet, daily courage that never made it into epic poems. A child's spoon, a prayer scrawled on parchment, a necklace made of rosemary stems, a mask that smells faintly of vinegar, a stained apron stiff with soot and effort. These are the things they left behind, not because they wanted to be remembered, but because they had no time to clean up. You can still find them. In museums and tombs, in the gaps between cathedral floor tiles, a comb carved by hand, a note, "Wait for me near the well," a shoe too small for an adult, too practical for a doll. They didn't know they were making history, they were just trying to make it to next week. These aren't grand monuments, they are the scraps of survival. The plague didn't just test medicine, it tested memory. And memory, like plague, spreads. But it also fades, so these items, they anchor us, remind us. Someone was here, they lived, they stitched this cloth, they sharpened this blade, they buried their father with this bell, and if you close your eyes, you can feel them. The mother who gave up her last clean cup, the boy who learned to bake because his uncle died, the girl who kept singing, even when no one was left to listen. History doesn't always shout. Sometimes it just leaves the door ajar and hopes you'll notice. So notice. The next time you light a candle, or wash your hands, or pass a stranger on a narrow street, remember, you are surrounded by echoes, not ghosts, people, and the things they left behind. Final thoughts. Sleep well. The worst has already happened. And so, the doors close. The beak mask is hung by the door, the candles burn low, the red X's fade from the shutters, and the stories settle into ash, ink, and memory. You've seen the worst of it. The boils, the fear, the absurdity. The plague didn't knock politely. It kicked in the door wearing a crown of rats and a robe stitched from nightmares. And yet, people lived, they wept, they prayed, they laughed too loud at the wrong time. They fell in love at funerals, they sang badly, they smelled awful. They carried soup through windows and kissed their children even when they knew better. That's what survival looks like. A mess. It's not noble, it's not clean, it's coughing in a corner while whispering a hymn. It's hoping the chickens lay just enough eggs to trade for garlic. It's dancing barefoot in the mud because you're not dead, yet. We told this story because someone should. Not to glorify it, not to sanitize it, but to look it straight in the eyes and say, yes, we see you. Yes, you were awful. Yes, you left scars, but we're still here. And we remember. So now, rest. You've earned it. The fire's low, the shutters are bolted. The herbs are hanging where they always have. The world is quiet, not because it's over, but because it goes on. And so do you. Take a breath. Feel the weight of your own skin. Remember that not every cough is a sentence, not every shadow is a threat. Remember that someone came before you, someone with less who still made it through. Because humanity didn't survive the plague through brilliance, or wealth, or magic. We survived because someone refused to give up. Because someone stood in a doorway with a bowl of broth. Because someone sang when silence was easier. Because someone wrote it down. And now it's yours. This is the lullaby at the end of the world, a little broken, a little brave, sung by candlelight. Sleep well. And if you wake with a tickle in your throat, don't worry. You've heard this story before, and this time you know how it ends.